Everyone, good evening, welcome. My name is Frank Smigiel. I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Arts Programming, and you don't have to applaud for me. Here at the Fort Mason Center for Arts and Culture. It's my real pleasure to have this evening in conversation Ben Kinmont and Peter Coyote. The occasion is the show that's currently on view in our storehouse space across from Flax in Building D called Our Commons Are Free. It's an artist project by Ben that presents a portrait of the San Francisco Diggers through their publications with a focus on 4 presses, and we're going to be talking more about that tonight. Just to let you know a little bit about, I'm going to do a little bit of the official spiel, so forgive me, but just so we don't have a program tonight. Ben is an artist, a publisher, and an antiquarian bookseller whose work explores alternative systems of exchange, archival methodologies, and social sculpture. His project-based practice often involves publishing and distributing materials outside traditional art world channels to create more direct connections with audiences. He started his Antinomian Press in 1995 as an alternative to the commercial gallery system and as a means to distribute the free books and ephemera crucial to project-based work. I was lucky to work on a project with Ben, 12 years ago now, I think, at SF MoMA called Prospectus, and it's a real thrill to have him back for this project. We knew, in light of the subject matter of the exhibition, that it would be wonderful to get someone like Peter Coyote to join us to talk about the Digger moment, and we're just really honored you could come and join us tonight. You probably, all know that Peter is a very accomplished actor in more than 160 films. A 2-time Emmy Award-winning narrator of more than 200 documentaries and audiobooks, a distinguished writer who's penned 2 memoirs, Sleeping Where I Fall, the reading of which has been prime research for me tonight, so I have some idea of your arc through this moment, and also The Rain Man's Third Cure. Peter is also a contributor to numerous books and publications, a politically engaged person, championing a multitude of causes, a songwriter, a guitarist, and a singer, and a Buddhist priest. Starting with his work in the San Francisco Mime Troupe, and we're going to have to ask about this pronunciation because Ben and I go back and forth about whether it's anglicized or French, so we could say meme troupe. Peter was deeply involved with the Diggers and its evolution into the Free family. And we're really excited he will be able to tell us more about that this evening. So please welcome Ben Kinmont and Peter Coyote. Peter was kind enough to join us at the opening of the Our Commons Are Free exhibition. And so Peter, I thought maybe one way to open tonight would just be to ask you to do a little bit of what we asked at the opening, which is when people ask you today, who were the Diggers or what were the Diggers? What's your kind of big overview for the new audience?
Well, can you hear back there? Yeah. Good. So first of all, I have to apologize to any of the old Diggers who were here because we did everything anonymously. And so the idea that I'm representing or standing for this chaotic, anarchic group of people, and the reason we did everything anonymously and for free it was our feeling that if you weren't getting rich or famous for it, you were probably authentic. You probably really meant it. And authenticity was what the Diggers were about. They were also about, so in the 1960s, much of the social change movement was kind of loosely based on socialist or communist theory. There were a lot of little red books by Mao Zedong. There are a lot of posters, power comes from the barrel of a gun. And it just didn't feel to us like they were recording the American moment exactly. I was born in 1941, and there were communists in my family, and people who, like in their 20s, kind of bought the vision of communism. It sounded good, looked good on paper, and then Stalin killed the entire officer class of his his army when they lost the war, and people kind of saw what that was about. So I was not going to go for that as an alternative. And this kind of little feral genius named Billy Murcott showed up with Emmett Grogan one day, and they basically understood that the organizing principles of American culture were profit and private property, and that if we could give people a different perspective on those, if people could develop a life that they liked, they might defend it. But in the main, they were not going to throw themselves on the barricades to be Marxist lumpen proletariats. It wasn't going to work. So we got started because the Haight-Ashbury was swelling. Word was getting out of this free street life, and the newspapers were, sending out photographs of these kids smoking cigarettes in doorways, looking kind of free and unfettered. And lots of people were coming as tourists to look at San Francisco. And the city was capitalizing on it. They were running tour buses through our neighborhoods, and we were spray painting the windows because we weren't orangutans. It was kind of offensive to have people shoving a camera in your face. Anyway, we decided we would feed people because the city was doing nothing about a whole population of young people who were hungry, had no place to sleep, nothing to do. So we started out trying to get food from the farmers' markets, and the Italians would not give any food to strapping young men. So we sent the women nursing their babies, and God, they came back with hundreds of pounds of vegetables, and it was amazing. And we cooked it up in big milk cans, and we just advertised down the street that there'd be a free meal at such and such a time, Golden Gate Green. And the only requirement was you had to pass through a 6-foot by 6-foot yellow square called the free frame of reference. And if you passed through the free frame of reference, we gave you a little 1-inch by 1-inch square you could wear around your neck with a shoelace. And we just invited people to look at the world and consider how would it change your behavior if it were free. So from free food, we started free stores, which at first were just collections of garbage. But it was free. There are big boxes of filthy clothes and filthy shoes and everything. But in short order, we evolved to a beautiful storefront on Cole and Carl Street, glass fronted, and we had clothes, we had tools, we had furniture, we had kind of TVs, radios, everything worked. And the unspoken premise of the store was, why do you want to get a job? Why do you want to become an employee to make the money to become a consumer? We'll give you the shit for nothing. Now what do you want to do? And so the store itself was designed as a piece of theater. People would come in and they'd say, who's in charge? We'd say, you are. And if you just looked stupid or let your jaw hang slack, there was no sense blaming the pigs or the system or the man. You'd been given the opportunity to invent something and you dropped the ball. But if you said, well, I hate the way those shirts are done, let's change it, we just change it, we do it. And eventually we also got, San Francisco was a port of departure for Vietnam. And we got a whole series of federal draft card blanks. And we got the codes to fill them out so that they would pass muster. If it was from a certain state, you had to have a certain number in the third box and a certain number in the second box. And word got out surreptitiously, and Bobby from Chillicothe would come in and he'd leave his uniform in the free clothes and put on another set of clothing. We'd always tell him, keep the boots. And he'd go out as Billy from, Jacksonville, Mississippi. And so that was our quiet draft resistance. And so in short, it was to invent a world that you wanted to be in, that made sense to you, and that you would dedicate yourself to making happen. So we started the first free medical clinic, which is still running in the Haight-Ashbury. David Smith took it over. So just to wrap up this open-ended fastball you gave me, What we felt was that life was an act of imagination, and that most people were doing jobs that didn't mean much to them. And once people understood how much was up for grabs and how much you could change and how much you could build cooperatively, suddenly life took on this kind of catapult speed, so that in very short order, the Haight-Ashbury was like, it was like a psychedelic circus. You'd see Tonto walking down the street with Cinderella, and every parrots and hawks, and people were becoming their own fantasy selves. And we can talk about what we got right and what we did wrong at other times, but that was the gist of it.
And I'm certainly I'm going to want to come back to a lot of these threads. I mean, just the idea of the free frame of reference is just, and the object of it is just so resonant. And I'm someone who kind of came of age in graduate school in the 1990s. It was very inflected by European continental theory. I probably read more things in French translation than I read English 19th century novels, which I was supposed to be studying. But the more I've been sitting with this show and with Ben, the more I keep thinking about, I can't believe I didn't have that free frame of reference in the 90s, that the academe had kind of not looked to this uniquely American tradition. And I think, one of the things we maybe want to think a little bit about tonight is how things come into history, how they get forgotten, how they reemerge. And so, Ben, I wanted to ask you to maybe think about that a little, how you first became aware of this really important legacy, and then, decided to really start kind of working with its primary materials.
Sure. So, before I kind of launch right into that, I want to just say a quick, sort of express some appreciation to a few people who have been really important for me in realizing this project, which has been ongoing for the last few years. To the team here, firstly, the team here at Fort Mason, thank you for your hard work, your patience, and resources that they have committed to our Commons Are Free here in San Francisco. The exhibition is more than double than what it was at other venues. It's been in Italy and France already. And I'm grateful for the opportunities that were afforded me here. To Eric Noble, who guided and accompanied me on my research and made his collection available to me. His digger generosity has made so many things possible. To the Burroughs Bees, my family found, which is a group that I meet with of ex-communards, angels of lights, coquettes, and diggers. We meet on every Sunday on Zoom. Our conversations have helped explain parts of my childhood and given me the tools to embrace that period of my life. Although he is no longer with us in body, to Jet for his trust in me and belief in the movie that I was making. If you haven't been to the exhibition yet, there's a film there, and that will explain what I'm referring to here. To Peter Coyote and Billy Murcott for their openness and time spent in answering my questions. To my family, who has been so patient with me as I fell so fast and so deep into this incredible rabbit hole. All parts are interconnected, and my time in this project has affected them as well as me. Thank you for making space for this to happen. And lastly, to my mother, for reliving and sharing both the beauty and difficulty of those brightly colored stem cell years when my worldview was taking form. This project is for and of all of you. Thank you. So that's my appreciations. To answer Frank's question, which does tie into my mother and my childhood. So firstly, my father was a student at the Art Institute in the mid to late 1960s. During that time period, my mother would post up at Haight-Ashbury and in the park with me and my sister, and we would basically hang out while my dad was at school. And we were also living in a part of Marin County where there were a lot of artists who early on in the San Francisco Meme Troupe, when it was still called the Meme Troupe, they were members of the Meme Troupe. People like Chuck and William Wiley, Robert Hudson, Robert Nelson, Bill Geis, and other people. And so, in fact, this was sort of the environment in which I grew up in. And what happened was, having grown up in that kind of artist, 1960s, early 70s scene in the Bay Area, I actually worked really hard to leave. We were moving probably once a year, and in different places. At one point we moved to the desert and moved into a teepee to build a kind of community art school that my father had started. This is in the early to mid 70s. And so I worked really hard to leave and go into academia. That was my ticket out. And at one point I ended up in England, and I was studying something which felt very much my own, that was very different, I thought, from my background, which was I was studying mid-17th century English radical thought. And the funny thing was antinomianism. I was mainly focused on the ranters, but I also was studying the diggers. So this is, at this point in my life, that's in the mid-1980s. This whole time I'd been making art and had an art practice as well, and I was an American culture studies major. Then at one point I end up in New York, and I'm exhibiting and making art and showing. And as Frank mentioned, around 1995, I start a press called the Antinomian Press. So the original diggers, theologically speaking, were considered antinomians. And antinomianism is it means against, and nomian in the Greek means laws. And so antinomians are a theological group which were basically against laws, especially ecclesiastical laws. And they basically, like the Quakers today, or who could be argued to be the most successful antinomian group that still survives, they basically believe that one has an inner light that helps them understand the truth. And you have a direct relationship to truth and to God and to inspiration. When Anne Hutchinson was persecuted in the 17th century and accused of being a witch, that was technically called the antinomian controversy. So a lot of individuals who would assert themselves as having a direct sense of truth and what is right and wrong, despite what the laws and the power structures might say, in theological terms are often called antinomians. So here I was studying this material. Then also when I started doing projects out on the street, I've been printing things and handing out flyers on the street since about 1990, 89, 90. I also started working with Rare Books. As I was working with Rare Books, actually, let me pause. Just in around the year 2000, 2001, I'm an artist in New York City, and I got invited to come to San Francisco to be part of a conference at CCA about generosity in contemporary art practices. And while I'm there, I meet Peter for the first time. And Peter's one of the speakers at the symposium as well. And it's then that I start thinking about the diggers for a moment as Peter's describing them. And I remember my memory of the diggers as a child in the area at the time was mainly that there was sort of free food around, but mainly it had to do with like puppet shows and theater that was happening in the park. And my memory, Peter was talking about the different costumes and outfits that you'd see people wearing. My memory of that time was that it just felt like one big Renaissance fair. There were all these wonderful costumes, and everyone was open, and all of us kids could run around and do whatever we wanted. And there was a definite feeling of like imagination and fantasy. And I think one of the important things, which we can get into later in the talk, that I think is significant for me and my generation is you have to realize that Peter's generation, my parents' generation, came from someplace else and worked really hard to create that life and that scene in San Francisco. But when you're a child growing up in it, it's all that you know, right? I mean, you start your first, every meal is brown rice, right? And everything is about authenticity, and everything is about finding out who you are and being true. And that's the beginning point. And I think that, what ended up happening for me was, so the conference happens where I meet Peter, and then about 10 years later, I start encountering in the rare book world some of the flyers that the communication company ended up printing and distributing out on the street because they become collectible, and researchers are becoming interested in them in different universities. And I'm just blown away by the design, by the content of what they say, and I'm just utterly drawn to them. So I start doing more and more research on these flyers as a person who also, again, makes flyers for the street. I'm attracted and I want to know more and more. And this was sort of how the exhibition occurred. And to kind of cut straight to it, but the whole experience for me has been incredibly moving because it's answered a lot of questions that I had about my childhood. And I keep on running into places where my own family history folded into that of the Diggers, and things are being explained to me that are, it's sort of like looking at my childhood from an adult's gaze. And it's been a very important and kind of meaningful experience for me personally.
We're gonna, come back obviously to the street sheets. You can see on the right of the image here one of the communication company sheets that's in the show, and on the left is an install shot of the Free City News, the successor to the communication company, also being in the show. But thinking about running through the park and your childhood, Peter, I wanted to ask about kind of the theatrical roots of some Digger philosophy and Digger practice. I mean, you came out to San Francisco to study poetry, but you find yourself acting. I think you're in a production of Brecht's Edward II. And then you find yourself, moving, getting interested in the mime troupe. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what was so exciting in their approach to theater that drew you in.
So when I was about 14, I got interested in blues and folk music, Appalachian music and shape note singing. And I started going into New York City to Greenwich Village to the Hootenannies and saw people making music. The radio, people were listening to Paul Anka, and Ricky Nelson. And then there were really good musicians out there. And in Greenwich Village, you also ran into older bohemians. And if you were a curious kid and open, they'd say, well, you got to read this book, you got to read this book. And so I encountered the Beats. And from the Beats, I encountered Gary Snyder. And so growing up early, I just had these ideas of ways in which you could resist the culture or you could be critical of the culture. And those views were endorsed by people who were really good writers, really smart, and grown-ups, adults. So when I came to California, I'd been an actor in college. And there was a great drama coach in my college, an Irishman who had grown up, his parents were warders of an insane asylum. And he grew up with the inmates as his friends. And he was always half in the bag. And I was in the poet corner, black turtleneck sweaters, Camel cigarettes. We were all using Donald Allen's book, Modern American Poetry, 1945 to 60. And he plotzed into the seat one day and he said, I suppose it's never occurred to you that theater is about an idea of great moment danced before the public. And I said, no, I haven't. He says, well, if you have any balls, you'd come and you'd audition for my theater company. So I did. And he put together a theater company. He said, well, the fucking basketball coach doesn't use his second string. So he put together a company of people, and I just did plays all year long for 4 years. I really had a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. So when I came to San Francisco, I joined the remnants of the Actors Workshop here. The inventors of it, Blau and Irving, were taken out to New York to start Lincoln Center. And there was sort of the wreckage of the company that was left trying to hold on. And so we did this Brecht play, and I was into photography then, and I took 80 photographs of the rehearsals, and I mounted them on boards, and I put them up in the lobby, and we had this big opening, and afterwards nobody said a word about my photographs, not even thanks. So I was kind of pissed off. We had another theater, a small theater called the Encore Theater down on Mason Street. And I walked down here, and they had this great display out. Actually, that's what gave me the idea of the photographs. They had blown up newspaper clippings. They had photographs of people in these Commedia dell'arte masks and costumes. They also had two of the most thrilling women I'd ever seen in my life. And I thought, that's where I belong. So I went down there and I met Ronnie Davis, and the next thing I knew, I was in the mime troupe. And that was a very different order of magnitude. We were making it up every day. We were writing plays. We were using this 16th century Punch and Judy shows for adults with stock characters. Pantalone, that's me on the left. The old Yiddish miser I did with my grandfather's voice, that's Ronnie Davis. And we rewrote these plays about contemporary issues, and we took them out in the parks where the people were. And we survived by passing the hat. And the fact that we could do it, that we could make our own economy and we could survive on our skill and our wits, wasn't a lot of money, but it was something. And so that's the theater that Billy Murcott and Emmett Grogan came into. And Emmett was a very charismatic actor, and he was very good, but we were sort of a little full of ourselves because we were very popular, and Billy and Emmett challenged us. They said, you can do more. You own that stage. So even when you're improvising, when something goes wrong, when a drunk gets up on the stage, you can take time out, you can dance him off the stage, you can make people laugh, but you know where you are. Well, we want to do theater where we take the audience with us, where we create theater that the audience might not even know is a play, but suddenly they're in a reality that is different and governed by different rules. And something about the challenge and something about the inventiveness of it just stuck. And we started with the free food. And then, of course, we began living communally, save money. And eventually more groups joined us, the Free Bakery, the Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers from New York. And we evolved into the Free Family. And even though, you know, when kids came, everything had to get a little more organized. But people didn't give up and sell out their values. We have 107 people still on a email list called the Free Family Union. People are chipping in what they can, and we're covering about 15 people to the tune of $200 a month, little grace note on their Social Security, or people that have nothing, you know. So it's still happening as far as I'm concerned.
I wanted to add Peter Berg into the mix. Thinking about, I think is Peter the one who kind of named guerrilla theater as and also that wonderful phrase, which I'll probably get it wrong, but that you create the conditions you describe.
That's a Berg line. So Peter Berg was like our Lenin. He was a feverishly brilliant guy. Frightened a lot of people. I spent a lot of my time translating him to other people because I didn't frighten them. Peter was very, very smart. He had a great gift of language. And this idea of creating the condition you describe was actually his technique for manipulating the media. So, for instance, you know, the media is always sending out some guy in a suit and tie and saying, these strange young men and women are making a new life. Ben, tell us why. And so, you know, you were subject to their interpretation of you. So, for instance, Peter was one of the designers of the Death of Hippie Parade. And the Death of Hippie Parade was a big parade, and there was a coffin, a black coffin, and it said, Hippie, son of media, and it was covered with dollar signs. And all the people in the parade had mirrors, and every time somebody came up close to us, we'd shine the mirror at them. And so anybody who was awake was going to understand that we didn't call ourselves hippies, that hippies were a creation of the media. And we did any number of events like that so that all the press had to do was report what was going on, and people in Nebraska and in California and in Ohio would know and would get the real 411.
I'm going to go back to this one. There's this movement we're kind of seeing of strategies, techniques, way of being on stage come out, onto the street, quite literally, and then into your own way of organizing society. And I wanted just to, weave Ben in, because there's a project of yours that I also incredibly love called On Becoming Something Else, which kind of follows this trajectory, and maybe you could talk a little bit about it. And just to preface it, it's kind of about artists who do something in their artwork, and they get so into what they're doing in their artwork that art can't support it anymore. They leave and they become something else. And I don't know if maybe, Ben, there's a way to riff on these kind of two moments of kind of exiting art but using it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, just quickly about On Becoming Something Else. This project was, I was teaching grad school at the time at CCA, helping to start a new program called Social Practices. And a lot of my students were kind of coming through these, having a crisis at the end of graduation, where they found that they were not actually, as artists, they were doing things that didn't really fit within the art world any longer. And they were trying to understand, did I just go into debt for nothing at all? Or my parents are pissed off, they're wondering what I'm making, what I'm doing, how do I explain where I'm going? So I decided that, I needed to help my students and give and tell them, basically, of course, history is written by the people who remain and by the victors. And the same thing is true within the art world, that if you have an art practice which leads you outside of the art world, you're not going to be remembered within the art historical discourse. Recently, there's been some attempt to look at that, but for the most part, you're not included. So I decided to write a series of paragraphs, come up with examples of artists, and it wasn't artists who they said, oh, fuck the art world, I'm sick and tired of going into debt and struggling, I'm going to become a banker, or I'm going to become a truck driver or something. It was artists where the actual content of their practice led them into an area where they suddenly realized they could no longer call it art. And I wrote 7 different paragraphs, biographical paragraphs about people for whom this had happened. One had become an activist, one had become a doctor, one had become a psychotherapist, one had become a farmer, and so on. And I took these paragraphs, and I had been invited to do a project at the Pompidou Museum in Paris. And I set up with the Pompidou that I would then work with 7 different chefs in Paris. And there's a whole history within the history of food about recipes and representation. Like, how do you interpret, it could be like a sculptural representation in the sense of like a pièce montée, or it could be like just the ideas through the ingredients and the story behind the recipe. So I had 7 different chefs in Paris write recipes to represent the paragraphs. And so you went to the Pompidou and you got this broadside that you see on the side here, and it was a list of the stories of these people who had left the art world. And then you went to the restaurants and you ate the representation of their story. And part of the idea was also just like, so like for me, when I work on a project, I think, okay, this is something that needs to be done. There's a need in our community, in my community, that I identify with. And how can I meet that need? Sometimes it's a publication, sometimes it's an action on the street, sometimes it's a meal. And so I think that one kind of, I suppose, parallel situation in terms of like practice that happens for me in doing project art that is sympathetic with what I think the diggers were trying to do is that when looking at a need or an idea that needs to be shared, it's often a good idea to leave the institutional space, to leave the existing power structure that's there, whether that's a history, whether that's a physical building, whether that's a set of collectors, whether that's a media source, that it's just, sometimes you just need to figure it out and do it on your own. And I think that, I always talk about when I was teaching and for myself that to try to have a feeling of, to identify where the place of urgency is. What is urgent about what you're doing? And to be in touch with what that urgency is. And to not be dependent upon the sort of a priori structures that are around you and assumptions and premises. To be willing to let go of things. And I think that, perhaps this is connected to growing up around a bunch of people who were talking about authenticity or willing to drop things just to kind of keeping it real or to what's really needed at that moment. But I think that is one of the trends, or that's one of the threads that runs through what some artists today are calling a project art practice, is trying to identify and meet that need. And that's why you'll see project artists sometimes working with displaced people or people who aren't having a voice. So.
You know, in 1975, Gary Snyder won the Pulitzer Prize, and I had met him by then. I'd become fascinated with him. I determined to get to know him well, and we became friends. And the governor, Jerry Brown, appointed him to start an arts council of all working artists. And he did, and he asked me to join him. And we put together, there was one Republican named Carney Hodge, who was the president of the American Symphony Orchestra League, but everyone else was a working artist. And we knew that if we tried to just give money to artists, that the conservative wing in the California State Congress would go nuts, because they'd say, why don't you let the art market or the market take care of rewarding people? You're picking winners and losers. So we got around and we said, okay, what is it that artists do? What can we really bring to the state to demonstrate the value of artists in the culture? And a wonderful black sculptor named Noah Purifoy explained this thing called the creative process. And the creative process always starts with a hunch, an impulse. And maybe you make a splash of color, maybe you hum a few notes, maybe you write a line, maybe you draw something, and then you step back and you evaluate it with the rational part of your brain. And you say, okay, what are the implications of this? And by going back and forth between intuition and logic, you're actually using maximal correspondence between the two hemispheres of your brain. And so what we did, we said, we will use artists to teach creative problem solving, and we'll make any artist link up with a community organization. So we're not going to give you money unless you're going to work with a school, a community center, assisted living, an old age home. And at first the artists didn't like it. They got, I want to do what I want to do in my studio. Well, then do it, but don't ask us for money. But really within months, everybody had linked up. And then we also made interagency agreements with 14 departments of state that were never going to get their budgets cut. Department of Corrections, Health and Human Services. And we had artists solving problems for them. So we had filmmakers doing a film that won an Emmy with high school students on teenage pregnancy. We had dancers working with senior citizens to help them move. And as we did this, my whole idea of art became kind of cynical, because I realized that in popular parlance anyway, art is about creating entities that basically display tangible wealth. That's the way it had been co-opted by the elites of the culture. If somebody's getting $22 million for a painting, they're getting $22 million for a painting. They don't care what you think. But you can ask, what does that painting have to do with the culture? In the 1940s, when the avant-garde painting movement was starting and abstract expressionism was starting, Nelson Rockefeller and Peggy Guggenheim were smart enough to understand the implications of it, and they began to use it as propaganda against the Russian culture, demonstrating how free and fluid and liquid American culture was in producing this fabulous art. And what happened was, the painters, who had all been working with the poets and the dancers and all of that, were suddenly elevated to an elite set within the community in exactly the same way that the rock and rollers, who in the Haight-Ashbury had been just part of the community, playing for free in Golden Gate Park, suddenly they were getting $100,000 advances, and they were getting the best dope and the best clothes and the best houses. They were no longer in the set. So there was a way in which the diggers were moving against the idea of art as a fungible commodity and putting it into action and putting it into belief and putting it into commitment. So being anonymous and doing it for free was a real commitment. You had to figure out how to keep yourself alive. And all the problems started, like when I became an actor, I was working at the Magic Theater, and I loved it. I mean, I was just getting by however I could get by. Everybody loved it. But once you become a professional actor, you have to earn money. And from that point, I sort of refer to my career as humping donkeys in Tijuana. It's like, wash the beast, I'm coming. You have a job, you got something you have to do.
Actually, can I comment
Yeah,
on
go ahead,
that? So one of the things I want to comment on in that context, which is really also important about this show, is I very consciously am not working with original Digger documents. Okay, those are facsimiles that are in the exhibition. And I've done curatorial artist projects for a while, and I often work with facsimiles that I will make. And the reason I do that is because I want to be able to work with institutions that have smaller budgets. I want to be able to have a certain kind of flexibility. This show first exhibited in an anarchist space in Livorno in the north of Italy. They had no budget, or almost no budget. And if it had been original documents, which needed a museum guard, which needed insurance, which needed contracts, which needed loan forms and so on, conservation departments and so on, it never could have happened there. And so I also would like to say that when doing a project like this, when one's willing to kind of like rethink the institutional space you're going to participate with and the protocol that you yourself as an organizer is going to create, it's also important to realize that all of that is restricted and defined by the context that you're creating and that you're willing to participate in. And so there's a way, I think it's a tricky thing to do, because to tie into what Peter was saying about money and investment, one thing I've learned from this exhibition more than any other exhibition I've ever done is the connection between capitalism and memory. Things that don't have high monetary value are more likely to be forgotten and not preserved. Now, the nice thing about working in the rare book world is that you have institutions, special collections departments, that make an effort to save material, not even necessarily that because it will be important to researchers today, but it might be important to the next generation. So this idea of preservation and memory is something that they think about. But in the art world, this is not something that's discussed. The idea of a use value behind objects and documents and texts is something that is not usually discussed. So when doing a project like this, it was very important to me. And I would say here, being here at Fort Mason, working with Frank, who I'd worked with before, who knows the importance of for me of giving things away and of print, it was really fortunate because this is right at the cusp of like how big of an institution I could do this with and still maintain the feel that I need to have, And I'll use an example of where I just barely crossed the line, where at the opening, I wanted to cook the stew, which as I had done in Paris, I wanted to cook the stew and then make the bread as we did in Italy, and then serve it to people at the opening. But because this is an institution which has a liability issue with the food that's being served, I wasn't allowed to. So there's a sign that I had just gone a little bit too far, right? I couldn't do what I had done in Italy. I couldn't do what I had done in Paris when I worked with the art students while they were occupying the art schools. And so I think it's like, it's always interesting when making a decision to do something like this. How does one, as a practitioner of this kind of work, how does one make a project and have it still both create enough to create a memory, but not so much that it gets absorbed into something you don't want to be absorbed into?
My favorite things in the show were the reprints that you did of the Little Digger papers, because it made the content available and present and in a form that was appropriate to today, and they didn't have to be treated with great care and reverence because they were, artifacts. I could take a handful and give them to people and say, this is what we were about.
Well, and that's one of the beauties of free, right? Free is like one of the quickest, easiest, most direct ways to do something alternative to the dominant culture in society. It's such, and that's where a lot of its power lies, right? So that was also part of the issue with this show, is to have you go through a free store before you came into an exhibition. right? And so there are all these free publications, and that was one of the beauty of working with Frank and working with Fort Mason too, is that they were willing and they understood that, okay, Ben, you've got a bigger budget now than you did when you did it in the other venues. And I'm like, great, we're going to make more publications for free that we couldn't in the other venues. So let's continue to make stuff for free and even more for free, and which publications are important and which ones do we want to get out to people for free.
Yeah, and I want to keep on this institutional thread for a second, also recognizing time and recognizing that we want to invite you to bring questions to the table, and we do have mics at the end of each lane here, and we'll light up the house in just a little bit. So very quickly, I want to, Peter, ask you a question about institutions. I want to quickly ask a question about fame, and then I also, what's my last question? Oh, menace. So I'm just making a note for myself. Institutions, fame, menace. Institutions. Peter, when all of the feeds were happening, when the stores were happening, did you think in terms of institutions that these would last, or did you all think these were really experiments and they could take us anywhere, or you didn't have to theorize it that much?
Yeah, I don't think there was a lot of theorizing. I mean, I'll tell you a story I've told before, because there was a broth in the free stores, and it was interesting to be there. You never knew what was going to happen. So one day I was there, and there was an elderly African-American woman, and she was down there, other end of where I was sitting, and I saw that she was shoplifting in a free store. So I went over to her, and I said, ma'am, I couldn't help but notice you over there. You can't steal here. And she said, I'm not stealing. I said, I know. You can't steal because it's a free store. If you want something, just take it and put it in your purse. She says, free? I said, yeah, it says up there it's a free store. She said, was it free? Get out of my face. I said, okay, I'll do that. The next day, she came back with a flat of day-old donuts and put them on the counter. So here was a woman who got radical exchange, free exchange, in just a hot minute. So those things would happen. But at a certain point, like, we burned out. It wasn't my highest aspiration to run a soup kitchen. And after feeding people and running the free store and stuff in the Haight, we wanted to actually move out on the land and get in continuity with some of the native and indigenous wisdom that was the encyclopedic knowledge of how to live in Northern California. So our own evolution took us away from the institutions. I didn't have any fidelity to keeping them going.
Thinking of the people who were keeping all this going. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the folks in the mix here. What a great looking group they often are. Because you do write about, the Diggers were not only freeing people from money, but from fame. And, what does it mean to, whether that's a part of living authentically, or, I'm just so curious about how you reflect on that as someone who's been in and out of whatever fame means, thinking about the 60s when, what's the Fran Lebowitz quip about Warhol, that Warhol made fame more famous. This is all, I guess, a bigger question about assuming a persona, anonymity, and maybe a rejection of American star power, or a way to rework it. I wish this question were more pointed. It may be about, Emmett Grogan might really be the question.
Yeah, so Emmett is the guy in the cap with the scarf around him, and everybody but the leaping man there, who's Kent Minogue, is dead. But Emmett had a perfect persona for that time, and it stayed appropriate for about 3 years, and then it ended, and he couldn't keep up. But we were always ambivalent because the Diggers were quite famous, and people would vie to get us in their houses or at their parties, or in LA, they'd vie to give us money and things. And I remember one time a Hollywood producer gave Emmett a $2,500 check, and Emmett immediately picked up the phone and called Huey Newton and said, Hugh, I got $2,500 for you. And he did that just to teach the guy that you can't pay your way in with the diggers. So we were ambivalent about fame, and we had sort of certain kinds of jealousy. For instance, like the guys in the Grateful Dead could come to a digger house and they could hear the smartest ideas of the day being discussed and worked out. And then I could read them in Rolling Stone in their interviews. But if we went to them and said, hey man, we want to do a big event in Golden Gate Park, can you give us some money to help us get the food or to get the generator or something? They might say, well, don't you have your money trip together? We say, no, we don't have our money trip together. So there was a certain amount of ambivalence. We wanted to be recognized, but not by the personality. And then when I got into Hollywood and got into projected into movies, and then even worse, the publicity for the movies, you know, everybody's really interested in everything that celebrities do, where they shop, who they sleep with, what they wear, everything but what they think. And as soon as you open your mouth about ideas that are like tangential to the major paradigm, they tell you to shut up. But I found fame to be completely oppressive. It was one of the reasons I left movies, because it meant you were up for grabs for anybody. Anybody could come and interrupt you at dinner or walking down the street, and as a fan, as the people who were helping send your kids through school, you had to be polite. It was a big deal to them. But I remember once I was in Spago and my wife and I were having an argument and my wife was weeping, and I looked over my shoulder and there's a woman crouching with a pad and a pen going, you could have an autograph. So there's, you know, fame actually has to do in this culture with commodity. How many asses can you put on the seats of a concert hall or a movie? You have a value. And also fame stands for, it's a stand-in for communities that don't exist. Like if Ben says, oh, I met Peter Coyote, he can go to you, and you might know who I am, and you have a common subject of conversation. Or, hey, I met Brad Pitt today. Wow, people will ask you about it, because the idea of the original community where we're all intimate with each other has been dispersed and displaced by unlimited, unregulated capitalism. We're all moved all over the place.
There's Emmett. That's the photo I was looking for. The corollary here is some additionally good-looking guys. Is Ben, maybe just, and then we're going to definitely turn to all of you. Tell us a little bit about, because it's adjacent, but it's not the same, about the artist's signature and what it means to work in projects that maybe invite the audience in a way that's not just an observer. When you're kind of, it's a question about authorship, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when you're doing project art, another way to talk about it is you're doing participatory projects. You're out on the street, you're talking to strangers. You got to remember, when you go to museums, there's a state of consensus, right? People have come into the museum to have an experience, and so if you want to throw a pile of the garbage you found outside on the floor and leave it there, people are going to come in and look at it and take it seriously. There's a consensus that they're there to see art. They're going to have an experience of art. If you're out on the street talking to strangers, or in a stranger's home trying to wash their dishes or whatever, the issue of consensus and why you're there and what it means that you're being there, and the discourse and the value structure that's there is totally turned upside down. And everyone's trying to figure out what the hell's happening, what's going on. I did a project in Munich called Ich werde Ihr Schmutzgeschirr waschen, which means I will wash your dirty dishes, where I handed out flyers on the street offering to come to people's homes to wash their dishes, and then I spent a week in strangers' homes washing their dishes. And so, as an art project. And so, and what was interesting is that, right, what the participants ended up doing was to control this stranger coming to their home, they would determine how many dirty dishes were there. If like a young woman who was by herself, she had only 3 dishes there. She was very cautious. There were a bunch of students who had just had a big party at the university before, and there were like thousands of dishes. So it just varied, right? And in terms of how meaningful it was or boring it was, depended upon the situation, the conversation that happened, and how we understood what it was that I was doing. in that particular project, I've since 1990 created these things called the gift sculpture, which I call the gift sculpture object. When you're doing these participatory pieces that are so strange, it's a little bit like meeting somebody on a train, and I'm referring to an era before iPhones, where people would actually talk to each other on the train. And you might have an intense conversation with a total stranger, and you might reveal something about yourself that you might not reveal to your partner or your parents or something. And when you leave that train, it's always a bit awkward, and you always want to like, oh, do we exchange numbers or not? And you probably know you're never going to talk to each other again, but you always try to do something at the end. So doing the participatory pieces is a bit similar. And so what I would create with these little objects, and in the case of the Dirty Dishes project, I had a sponge that was signed by me and the participant. And that is intended to kind of reference the connection of art and meaning. So I would argue that art is about an awareness of the experience of the creation of meaning. And I think that when you're doing an art project, when you're doing a piece with somebody that's out on the street, in their home, or wherever the case might be, and in a space outside of institutional space, the meaning of the piece is being created by everyone involved. It's not just me. Sure, I initiated it. I handed out what I call a catalytic text, which is to get something to happen. But we are all involved in the creation of the meaning. And I will often have little motions or things that happen to kind of reference that decentralization, that breaking up of the author, and to include other people. And I think that that's an important thing also when one's trying to do these projects. And even for myself, while doing this project, I'm working with people like Peter or Billy and people who are still alive. And everybody who are participating with me in this is learning to acknowledge and listen to the meaning that's being created around me, the meanings that they've created before, and try to be respectful to them, but then also somehow bring it up to the present so that there is a memory of it. Because the younger generation is stoked to hear these stories. I happened to be in Paris doing the project when there was all this protest against Macron a couple Aprils ago. There was literally a 30-foot fire of burning garbage outside my window the first night I was there. Students were occupying the art schools. They had been living there for 6 months. Classes weren't happening. Protests were happening everywhere. They were utterly, they had created their own assembly where they were trying to restructure the École des Beaux-Arts system in France. And they were thrilled to hear about the diggers. And they were thrilled to hear about what worked, what didn't work, how they organized themselves, what the examples were. Because they only had May of '68. They wanted to hear about something more than May of '68. So there's a lot of interest in this material right now. And with the period that we live in with Trump, there's a lot of urgency for this information right now. And so I think it's a great time to bring it forward, to create those memories.
I'm glad you brought up the experience in France, just because the last bit I wanted to just kind of get to is, there's, I think in my very cursory beginning understanding of the Diggers, I really did kind of think of all of you as kind of like the do-gooders of the counterculture, like you were kind of saving everyone. And as I was moving
That was nice of you.
Yeah. And as I was moving through Ben's project and the street sheets, I was like, these are kind of really provocative, and there's a real avant-garde tradition in the language of the street sheets, of a kind of punch and a slap there. I put this 1% free image up, and then also this ad for the free bank using it, because from what I understand, it was perceived as having a kind of menace to it among some communities. And I wonder if maybe you might talk just a little bit about that,
Sure.
the punch of the Diggers.
Sure. We were provocative. We thought we were onto something, and we thought it was important, and we were proud and maybe even a little snobby about it. And when we put together these 1% free posters at Peter Berg's house, they were stenciled, and then the faces of the Chinese people and their hands were mimeographed and pasted on. And it was a photograph of two Tong hitmen from 1905 at the corner of Jackson and Grant in San Francisco. That was a Chinese character for liberation above. And 1% free could mean what you meant it to mean. For me, it meant that about 1% of the people were willing to go all the way and play for keeps. To a lot of the Haight-Ashbury merchants, they thought we were shaking them down for 1% of their profits. I mean, they were freaked out. So that raises an ancillary point. We were not exactly do-gooders. I mean, we stole a lot of stuff. We lived on hot credit cards. We did whatever we could. You know, I'm sure Che Guevara took the ammunition from dead soldiers. They didn't not use it because it was the establishment's or the man's. But that behavior and that certainty of our correctness and that sort of playing for keeps and without restraint also had a negative capacity. And when I think about the counterculture writ large and how aggressive we were about our style, about free love, about all sorts of things we were convinced were 100% right, we got way over our skis in terms of the Midwest and the majority of the American population. And they slapped us awake. They elected Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. And we had 20 years of neoliberalism and unregulated capitalism, resistance to civil liberties. And I've thought about that very often and long, that the certainty that you're correct and the lack of a willingness to compromise and pay attention to the sensibilities of other people have a real cost. And about 5 years ago, I was invited to Harvard to teach a course on the ceremony of protest. And I worked this class out because I noticed that so many protests wind up as Republican campaign videos. You know, it only takes one burning car and everything you thought you were there for is gone out the window and people are running against it. And so I worked out these kind of simple steps. The first thing is to know that a protest is a ceremony. It's an invitation to a better world. And nobody accepts an invitation when they're being screamed at. It just doesn't work. The second most important thing is to know who the object of the protest is. It is never the police. It is never the politicians. It is never the Board of Supervisors. It is always the American people who are looking to understand who they can trust. And if you win their trust, then you win power at the ballot box. And then you actually can make change. And there were just a couple quick ways to ensure that. One was let women organize it. It's more cohesive, it's less combative, more inclusive. Second one is to appoint monitors right away. Give them yellow vests and whistles. And their only job is to watch for violence. And at the first sign of violence, they blow the whistles and the real protesters sit down. Let the police take out their aggression on the people, breaking up small merchant storefronts and burning shit in the neighborhood and making it unlivable. The third thing is to dress like you're going to church. Doesn't have to be fancy, but clean, respectful, turned out clothes to show the American people this is serious. When you show up in hoodies and clothes, you can't tell the cops from the killers. The fourth one is make your protests silent. Let the signs speak and show the American people your discipline. And the fifth one is go home at night. Come back in the morning fresh. And if you do that, you'll gradually win the trust of people and they'll know that you're not going to embarrass them. But if you look at what's happening in the counter protests in LA, people are burning cars, maybe the cops are burning cars. You just don't know, but it creates a counter narrative that just undoes everything you've worked for.
I want to offer an opportunity if folks feel so moved to come to one of these microphones and pose a question to Ben and Peter. And as you're thinking about it and getting ready to move, I'll just note I was going, I think, to try to end it. Our questions. Peter, I think you say it may have come originally from Peter Berg, but this idea of a kind of planetary frame of reference is what made Digger events oddly kind of ally-driven. Like I think the quote I have here is, people often expressed amazement at how thousands of disparate and often antithetical groups, Hells Angels, Black Panthers, gay collectives, merchants, runaways, soldiers on leave, flower children, deserters, and civilians could interact so peacefully at our parties.
Absolutely.
And that just seems so wonderful.
So all of the Digger events were celestial. They occurred at the vernal equinox or the summer solstice or the midwinter solstice. Those are planetary events. And because the frame of reference was planetary, it was the largest frame of reference. No one was excluded. And because of that, we very rarely had stages that were private property. And so when the Grateful Dead came to Peterburg and they wanted to throw a concert for the Rolling Stones, we said, no, we're not going to do that. That's not what we do. If you want, we'll have an event and we'll have 6 stages. The Rolling Stones can have one of them, but we'll give them redwood trees to plant and bolts of silk. But that's not how we roll here. And they said, no, man, it's the Rolling Stones. And they started Altamont. That's how Altamont began. And we knew that was not going to work out. The only digger that went was Emmett, because it was not a free concert. They had collected all those people as extras in a documentary film about the Rolling Stones. And by the time they got there and they realized it was sort of a scam, the vibe changed. It got really angry and mean-spirited. And, people had been inculcated into what free meant in San Francisco. And you couldn't just come in and play with that.
I have to look and see if there are folks who might want to join us. Great. And hopefully that's running.
It's kind of, yeah.
Peter, can you describe the Digger papers a little bit for folks?
Hey,
Yeah.
I was here first.
So there were 2 sets of Digger papers. I mean, Digger papers were broadsides that the communications company and Freeman House and David Simpson printed up, and it was our way of communicating with the people on Haight Street to tell them what the information was, what the real deal was. We were not going to allow ourselves to be translated by the media. But then Paul Krasner, who published a magazine called The Realist, gave us an entire issue. And we did this issue, and I mean, Michael McClure was in it, Allen Ginsberg was in it, great writers were in it, everybody was in it anonymously, and it still exists. Ben reprinted it, and it's still kind of has a life of its own. You can't trust the media if you don't own it.
Go ahead.
Hey, thanks for doing this, you guys. I have a question for you, Peter. I wanted to know if you would say something about kind of a tangential outgrowth from the Diggers, which is like bioregionalism through Peter Berg and
Sure.
Bennett Drum. And you kind of started touching on it when you were saying about the indigenous, how to live in Northern California. And I feel like this is something that's got a new kind of a rebirth that's happening right now, especially in environmental circles. People are really talking about bioregionalism again. I'm working on a film with my friend here about it, and I'd just love to hear how that fits with
Sure.
the Digger philosophy.
We actually organized the Arts Council according to bioregions. So bioregionalism was a study of the kind of deep ecologists. Ray Dassman, Peter Berg was a theorist of this. And basically, it was the understanding that instead of thinking of territories as straight lines on a map, you looked at the way the Earth organized itself. And there were certain plant, animal, climate, and human activities that were all intertwined. So, for instance, in California, north of the Tehachapi Mountains, everything from there all the way up to Washington and Oregon is redwood, cedar, spruce, deer, salmon, crow, winter wet, summer dry. And within that, there are small microclimates and communities, and the people who live in them establish a kind of culture. And what Peter did and Judy Goldhalf, they put together a journal called Planet Drum, and they sent it around the country, and people began contributing the way that they were living in certain places, thinking of the Earth as a bioregion, which is a natural, living, vibrant community. And it's actually the way we're going to survive on the planet if we survive. We're not going to live here by creating carbon scrubbing machines that cost $1 billion and scrub 12 minutes of carbon out of the air for $300 million a year. We're going to learn how to live closer to the Earth and mimic more of the Earth's procedures in the way we live. A little less greedily, a little more funky, a little more hands-on, and a little more respectful of the Earth itself. And that really came to fruition, and Peter Berg was one of the big architects of that. But so was Gary Snyder, so was Raymond Dassman, so was Wendell Berry. It's actually old wisdom. It's not new, and you can understand it in 5 minutes, and then it takes the rest of your life to actually learn how to live in a place.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about a lot came out of the Mime Troupe in terms of their support for a group like the committee. When the committee started here, obviously Diggers having connections with that, and then Bill Graham also coming out of the Mime Troupe. But there seemed to be a lot of collaboration and cooperation between those groups. And I don't know if that touches into the Artist Liberation Front as well. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the cooperation and activism at that time and how you guys worked together.
Well, I mean, you see it right here. Ben and I live in the same town, and I didn't know him. And when people of like mind meet, and they start finding that they share certain beliefs or certain feelings, you pick it up. So the Artist Liberation Front began in response to the Vietnam War, and it pulled together the artistic community. But it was through the Artist Liberation Front that I met Lenore Kandel, the poet, and Bill Fritch, Sweet William, who was a digger, became a Hells Angels, brought the Hells Angels and the Diggers together. And so there was just a kind of, it was an opening moment. Gary Snyder has a great phrase called the Great Underground. And what he says is, imagine a river that surfaces every 20 or 30 years. And when it surfaces, men grow their hair long, we get priestesses, we get artists, we get musicians, we get earth-worshiping practices, we get craftsmen, we get spiritual traditions, and then it sinks underground for a while. People go back. When people cut their hair short, they're giving their sexuality to the state. When they grow their hair long, they're keeping it for themselves. So from the Diggers going backwards, there was the Beats, and before the Beats, there was America in the, Paris in the 30s. Then before that, there's the American Transcendentalists. It's not like any of this is necessarily new, but when you find people that are resonating on that wavelength, natural affinities take place. And I can't explain it or own it, but when you see somebody that's a brother or sister, you know it, and you hang out with them, and nifty shit happens.
I think we should leave it on nifty shit happening. So, thank you all for coming, and gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.